Charge d'Affaires Robert Dickson, thank you so much for talking to Amu. You recently visited Kabul. How did it feel to be back in the city, which is now ruled by the Taliban?
Well, it was very good to be back in Kabul. I mean, I spent 2 years in Kabul from 2013 to 2015. I had very fond memories of my time there, and I had many Afghan friends while I was there. And I emerged from my time in Kabul with huge respect for the resilience and the way in which the Afghan people have handled the very difficult time that they've been through. So it was very good to be back. It was, of course, an interesting thing to be engaging with the Taliban, and I had a number of really candid discussions. I was able to meet a wide variety of senior people in the Taliban, and I had some really interesting conversations with them. We still have, as the UK, some significant interests in Afghanistan. We're still very keen that Afghanistan is not used as a base for anyone to wage any sort of international terrorism. We're very interested in counter-narcotics. We're very concerned about the situation, the humanitarian situation of the Afghan people, 28 million of whom need urgent humanitarian assistance. And we still have British citizens in Afghanistan to whom we need to provide consular assistance. And in order to pursue all of those interests, we can only do that by talking to the people who are currently in charge, which means the Taliban. So we had some very candid discussions with a whole variety of people in that administration.
So when you say candid discussion, interesting visit, what do you mean by candid discussion? What kind of issues were raised in those discussions?
Well, I think what I would say is that the Taliban were very keen for there to be recognition of the things that they say have gone well in Afghanistan. So they talked about how Afghanistan is now more secure. They talked about their success as they presented in counter-narcotics. They talk about what they've done to change the atmosphere around corruption. They talked about how exports in some parts of the economy are now much higher. And so I listened to that. It's very interesting to hear their perspective. But I also made clear that we have concerns about significant aspects of what the Taliban are doing. And in particular, I said that from a British government perspective, we think that the edicts which are restricting the rights of women and girls are both wrong in themselves, because we are committed to a universal vision of human rights in which women and girls have equal rights. And we think that excluding them from education and employment is the wrong thing to do. But it's also having the practical effect of making it much more difficult for members of the international community, including ourselves, to do the sort of practical things with the Taliban that we would quite like to do. So it has both a universal
when you say that,
but also a practical element that is, we think, very unwelcome. So I made that clear in my response to what the Taliban had told me about the progress that they claim that they have made.
So when you say that they were claiming all those progresses in different fields, including corruption, tackling counter-narcotics, and terrorism, do you believe in those progresses and those claims by the Taliban? Because recent reports by the UN Security Council shows quite the opposite.
Well, I think we look at the evidence, and I mean, clearly the evidence is that with the effectively the end of the war in Afghanistan, clearly, levels of civilian casualties are much lower than they were a couple of years ago. And there is, I think, good evidence that certainly in terms of primary poppy cultivation, the Taliban have achieved some success in eliminating poppy from places where it had been very well established. And there is, I think, anecdotal evidence that suggests that they have had some success again in reducing corruption. And they have also, I think, had some success in increasing exports, particularly of coal, which is going over the border to Pakistan, reflecting, I think, perhaps a difficult energy situation there. So I think there is evidence that the Taliban have been achieving success in some of the ways that they have set out. But as I say, we recognise that, but at the same time, we are very clear that there are very significant shortcomings in the way that the Taliban are running Afghanistan. What they have set up is not the sort of inclusive settlement that we think is the best way to achieve lasting peace in Afghanistan. And as I said, we are particularly concerned about the series of edicts which have a very serious impact on the rights of women and girls in Afghanistan. And what we said is that we think that progress on both of those things, both on a more inclusive political settlement and on respect for the rights of women and girls, would greatly increase the ability of ourselves as the UK, but also the wider international community to engage with the Taliban in a way that we, in practical terms, would like to do. But I should be clear that we don't think that engaging with people is not endorsing them. It's a basic diplomatic principle that you talk to everybody that you can. You talk to your people you don't agree with as well as people you do. And by talking to them, you are engaging them, but you are not necessarily endorsing them or the things that they do. But you need to talk if you're going to find common ground, and that's really what I went to Kabul to do. And as I said, I think there are significant areas where there could be common ground if there is some movement.
I know that one of the main concerns of the UK, as you mentioned, in Afghanistan is security concerns, right? But after the fall of Kabul in the hands of the Taliban, we saw that the leader of Al-Qaeda was there. And there are numerous reports by the UN Security Council shows that the presence of Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups are increasing in the country, right? Did you see any examples of those kind of threats in your visit in Kabul?
Well, there is clearly a threat, in particular from Daesh. We've seen how Daesh in Khorasan province, as they call it, Daesh in Afghanistan, is a serious threat. And clearly it's a threat to the Taliban, but it's also potentially a threat to the wider world. So it's a serious problem. And it's also worth saying that Daesh is a threat to the Taliban as well. So,
what about Al-Qaeda? What about Al-Qaeda? I mean, Taliban have been talking about Daesh since ever now. But what about Al-Qaeda? Their leader was in Kabul and killed by a US strike, right? So are you concerned about Al-Qaeda or not at all?
Of course we're concerned about Al-Qaeda.
Are you concerned about Taliban's ties with Al-Qaeda?
Yes, we are concerned about the Taliban's ties with Al-Qaeda, and it was one of the things that we discussed while we were there. I mean, one of the basic principles of diplomacy is that a country should not allow its territory to be used as a base for attacking other countries. That was what, of course, led to the intervention in Afghanistan in 2001. And we made clear to the Taliban that, as they agreed in the Doha Agreement, they should not be hosting terrorist groups of any description.
So during your meetings with the Taliban, this issue was raised, of course, as you mentioned. What was their response to you?
They acknowledged the commitments they had made.
But what about presence of Al-Qaeda's leader in Kabul?
Well, we didn't. I mean, that was last year. We didn't talk about him in specific terms because that was an issue for last year. But we made clear that any continuing presence of Al-Qaeda is clearly going to be a barrier to developing the sort of relationship that we would like to develop, where we can talk about practical things that will benefit the Afghan people.
Right. So, what are basic and more important concerns of UK from a security point of view from Afghanistan? Daesh and what else?
Daesh is the main one. But if there were other terrorist groups that were operating in Afghanistan, and clearly, there is a long history of different terrorist groups operating both in Afghanistan and in the wider region. And the best way we think of dealing with these groups is to talk to the people who are in charge of the territory, and that is the Taliban. And clearly, there is a particular common interest in Daesh, who have attacked communities. They, I think, would like to attack from Afghanistan. At the moment, clearly, they have been attacking in Afghanistan. They've been attacking the international community. They've been attacking Taliban targets, and they've been attacking minority communities in Afghanistan. And clearly, that is a very unwelcome development. And we all have a common interest with the Taliban in preventing that from happening.
Yes, but Taliban have been described as a group which was providing an umbrella for different, terrorist groups in the past 2 decades in Afghanistan, and this term was used by international community time and again that Taliban were providing this umbrella. So, do you trust in a group which used to provide this kind of sanctuaries and umbrella to all these terrorist groups now as a partner to fight the terrorists back?
Well, we have to judge by the evidence. We have to judge by the evidence. We need to engage with them. We need to tell them what we think. We need to listen to what they say, and we need to judge them by what they do.
And did you find them?
That's our policy going forward.
Yeah. Did you find them trustworthy during your interventions with them?
As I said, we'll judge by the evidence. We'll judge by the evidence of what they do going forward.
Yes. You just mentioned the 9/11 attacks on the U.S. and also the coalition which went to Afghanistan. The UK was a leading partner in that coalition, of course, and sent over 10,000 troops to Afghanistan over the years, and I believe over 500 UK soldiers British soldiers were killed in the country. So, yes, you were part of the Operation Enduring Freedom from day one, which started in October 7, 2001. How does it feel to be back in the country, which is ruled now by the Taliban, and Al-Qaeda is back there, and women are deprived again from their basic rights, and human rights abuses widespread? Does it feel like a defeat to you and the UK?
I mean, it's not where we wish to be, but it's where we are, and you have to judge the world by how it is, not how you wish it was. And so for us, we need to be pragmatic. The Taliban are clearly firmly control the territory of Afghanistan. As I said, we still have very significant interest in Afghanistan, whether that's security, drugs, humanitarian, consular. And the only way we can take forward those interests is to deal with the Taliban while they're in charge, while they are the de facto administration. So that's what we have to do. And I think the fact is that nearly 2 years after the Taliban came back to power, they are clearly in control of Afghanistan, and we clearly have interests that we continue to need to pursue. But as I said, that doesn't mean that we endorse the Taliban, but it does mean that we need to engage with them in order to take forward our interests and take forward what we hope will be assistance to the Afghan people who are in a very bad way. 28 million out of 40 million people in Afghanistan are in urgent need of humanitarian assistance. And the only way that we can deliver that is by talking to the people who are on the ground. And as I say, all over the world, we have diplomatic relationships or non-diplomatic relationships, as in this case, with people with whom we may not agree, but with whom we do need to be able to do business.
Yes.
And that
recently, Mr. Tobias Ellwood, chair of the House of Commons Defence Select Committee, has suggested that the UK should reopen its embassy in Kabul. Is that, you think, the policy of your government?
Well, that's a suggestion. Mr. Ellwood is a member of the governing party, but he's not a member of the government. It's an interesting contribution to the debate. I'm sure it'll be listened to respectfully. He's someone with long experience in these matters. And I think there's plenty that we can do, even if we don't reopen the embassy immediately. There is still plenty that we can do in terms of the sort of engagement I was doing this month, and that I will hopefully repeat regularly and frequently during the time that I'm doing this job.
What is preventing the UK from reopening the embassy in Kabul? Or what are some conditions that you have for reopening your embassy in Kabul?
Well, I think, as I said, I mean, at the moment, engagement with the Taliban is made more difficult by the fact that they are making edicts, they're producing edicts and decrees which severely limit the rights of women and girls. And on this, they are an outlier compared with any other government in the world. As I said, a basic principle of diplomacy is that you talk to people you don't agree with, not just to those that you do. But at the moment, the Taliban have become an outlier on issues surrounding discrimination against women and girls, and that makes it harder to take forward the sort of practical relationship that we would like to have with them. But that doesn't mean that we won't engage, but it definitely acts as a limiting factor when it comes to the sort of political relationship that we can develop with them. And as I said, there's plenty that we can do that doesn't amount to the reopening of an embassy, whether that's through regular visits or doing what some of the other countries that are engaging, like the Turks or the Japanese or the European Union, are doing, where they have a representative office on the ground and they talk regularly to the Taliban, but they don't, of course, extend that to formal diplomatic recognition. So there's lots of options, but the key thing is being able to do the business. And the business, as I said, for us revolves around security, drugs, consular, narcotics, all of the things that mean that we still need to be engaged with Afghanistan.
The things
and I think if you look back at mistakes that were made by the international community, one of the biggest mistakes was in the 1990s when Afghanistan was last ruled by the Taliban, and very little international attention was paid to Afghanistan. And that was what led to the conditions which enabled the 9/11 attacks to be mounted from that territory. And we are very keen, along with our international colleagues, to prevent that sort of international neglect leading to the sort of disastrous outcome that we saw in 2001. So I think there's a very strong case for engagement, while making clear, as I said, the areas where we don't agree, as well as looking at the areas, the practical areas.
So if the Taliban, reopen schools for the girls and allow women to go to work and go to universities, you think the UK is really ready to recognize the group?
Well, I think it would be very helpful. I mean, it's not for me. It's a political decision for ministers around recognition. But I think it's fair to say that a different approach by the Taliban to women's rights, expressed both through employment, particularly in NGOs and the UN, and education, will be enormously helpful to setting a more positive atmosphere around political engagement. At the moment, there is a difficult atmosphere around political engagement. It's not impossible, but it's more difficult. Because of the things that they have been doing, because of the edicts they have issued over the last couple of years. So a change in the edicts, a change in that direction of travel would be very, very helpful.
We all know that the US has a deal with the Taliban, the Doha deal. Does the UK also have a separate understanding with the Taliban, or you trust the Doha deal for safeguarding your interest in the country?
Well, we don't have a deal. I mean, the Doha deal was obviously one between the US and the Taliban, so we don't have a formal agreement of that kind. But it was made very clear by the Taliban when I was in Kabul that they were very pleased to be having the sort of discussions that we were having. And as I said, I was very pleased to be there because we do have significant interests, and the only way that you can really explore how you can deliver those interests is by talking to the people who are in control on the ground. So although we don't have a formal agreement, we clearly do have a sort of practical understanding that enables us to have those sort of conversations.
So in the Doha deal, United States says that Taliban shouldn't use Afghanistan soil against the United States and its allies, which is UK is of course a significant ally of the United States. So do you trust the Doha deal for safeguarding your interests, or you think it has some shortcomings, the Doha deal?
Well, we weren't a party to the Doha agreement, and it's not for me to judge any aspect of it really. But what I would say is that the discussions that I had with the Taliban suggest that they want to do the sort of, as I said, practical cooperation that we talked about, and both sides were clear. We were clear that we don't think that there's any scope for violence in terms of producing political change in Afghanistan. We don't think that there's anything to be gained by anyone trying to change the political dispensation of Afghanistan by force. There's been so much violence and suffering in Afghanistan over the last 45 years. We don't think that any more of that would be productive. But we do think, as I said, that everyone would benefit from a more inclusive political settlement. And we do think there is a very urgent humanitarian need. And we do think that it would be very welcome if the Taliban were to change course on what they've done in terms of edicts on women and girls relating to employment and education. So as I said, what we can do when we talk to the Taliban, make clear, we can understand better where they're coming from, and we can understand, what different people within the Taliban say about these things, because not all of them say the same thing. And it's also possible for us to make clear what our own suggestions, conditions, red lines are on moving a relationship forward.
What are the three main things that you expect the Taliban to do in the coming, next 1 year or two?
Well, I wouldn't, in terms of expectation, I think what I would say is that, there are things that the Taliban could do which would change the political atmosphere surrounding their engagement with the international community. And as we've said, one clear thing would be to change the direction of travel on the sort of really unique restrictions that the Taliban have imposed on women. No other country in the world systematically discriminates against women in the way that the Taliban do, and a change of direction on that would be very welcome. The second thing, I think, is that it would be very welcome if the Taliban could engage in some form of process which will lead to a more inclusive settlement in Afghanistan. At the moment, the Taliban represent one faction of really one population in Afghanistan. I know from my previous time in Afghanistan that it's a very varied and diverse country. And if a political settlement in Afghanistan is going to last, then I think you definitely need to see a settlement which enables all parts of Afghanistan's very varied population to be represented, to be able to have a political representation. So I think that's the second thing. And the third thing I think really re-engage with the international community, because the international community provides a huge amount of humanitarian funding to Afghanistan. Afghanistan is one of the poorest countries in the world. It has massive development needs, and a constructive engagement with the United Nations, with the major donor countries, with its neighbours, would be an incredibly positive way forward. And without developing that sort of interdependency, it's going to be very hard for Afghanistan to develop in a way that its population desperately needs. So I think those three things would be very good in getting us into a more productive situation.
But as we all, listening to the Taliban, they have refused to form an inclusive government. They have refused to open up for women, like for the employment opportunities and education. And they only are ready to engage with the international community. From these three things that you are expecting, they have already rejected the first two ones, right? So did you find any signs of opening from the Taliban or openness from the Taliban that they want to reopen schools and form inclusive government? Was this raised during the discussions?
I think what I would say is that I was very struck by the range of opinion that I encountered in Kabul. There is obviously the Taliban, like any human organization, will always contain a range of opinion. And the Taliban is no different in that sense. So there are clearly different people in different parts of the Taliban who think differently about all of these things. And I think the value of international engagement is to, first of all, understand where the different groups in the Taliban are coming from, understand their worldview. But secondly, make clear where the opportunities lie and where we think the challenges lie. And I hope that will help to feed the debate within the Taliban about how best to move forward.
So my final question is that the UK spent over £246 million in 2021 and a similar number in 2022 in Afghanistan, but that number is reduced to £125 million this year, 2023. Why is that reduction? What's the reason behind that?
Well, it's worth saying that we've spent 650 million since 2021, so we are among the largest donors. And I think what we're seeing this year is an extraordinary range of demands on humanitarian funding all over the world. So we have Ukraine, we have Yemen, we have Somalia, we have the Rohingya crisis in Bangladesh, and we have Afghanistan. And I'm afraid that the world is in a state where there are more crises than we've seen before in recent years. That's coupled with difficult economic conditions for us in the UK. So we are having to make reductions in our support this year, although we are still a very substantial donor. But I would hope and expect we will be able to put more resource into supporting Afghanistan in future years.
So, as you say, it's because of UK's internal issues and other international commitments, not because of the problems that Taliban administration has, including the human rights record and other things.
No, it's humanitarian support. It goes through the United Nations, through the Afghan Reconstruction Trust Fund run by the World Bank. So it goes through a series of instruments that make sure that it reaches the people who need it. And we have an absolutely rock-solid commitment to the people of Afghanistan going forward to continue to provide for their humanitarian needs. But as I said, that is in a context where there is more competition than ever before for international humanitarian resources, and where, as I said, we are not facing the easiest economic conditions at home in the UK. But we remain very firmly committed to doing everything we can to provide for the humanitarian needs of the 28 million people of Afghanistan who are in desperate need of assistance.
Yeah, and there has been, concerns, especially in the US, about how the Taliban might use or abuse the, money that goes through the United Nations agencies and organizations to the country. How do you make sure that Taliban are not using your taxpayers' monies?
Well, as I said, the money does not go through the Taliban authorities. It goes through well-established funding routes via either UN agencies like UNICEF, World Food Programme, World Health Organization, or it goes through the Afghan Reconstruction Trust Fund, which is run by the World Bank and has a very long track record dating back, I think, nearly 20 years in making sure that funding reaches people who need it the most. So we are very careful, along with other donors, about the way in which the money is spent.
Thank you so much, Charge d'Affaires Robert Dickson, for this opportunity, and we appreciate your time.
Thank you very much. My pleasure. Thank you.